Hi, welcome to Digging Deep with Dan. For over a week, beginning July 10th, 1925, a trial was held in Dayton, Tennessee, which on the surface was to determine whether John Thomas Scopes, a 24-year-old gym teacher, football coach, substituting in a biology class, had taught evolution in the local public school. It was a trial effectively staged by the American Civil Liberties Union in order to bring to public attention evolution as a progressive alternative to religious fundamentalism. The ACLU had placed ads in Tennessee newspapers seeking anyone who would be willing to challenge the newly enacted Butler Act, which forbade the teaching of evolution in Tennessee public schools. The events in the Ray County Courthouse, which had room for a few hundred, but uncomfortably accommodated 1,000 as the trial opened, were just part of the excitement in Dayton during the trial. Multitudes of spectators, including 2 chimpanzees and a small person held as the missing link, and media stormed into town as the trial was the first ever broadcast on the radio and as it became news even in Europe. It was better than the circus, wrote H.L. Mencken, who saw evangelical Christianity as a growing concern. He was one of the great movers, if you will, of this trial's becoming the national phenomenon and really international one that it was. This trial was overseen by Judge John Ralston, and it pitted a politician who had not practiced law in 30 years, who was a skilled orator, but was not a scientist and not a Bible scholar, William Jennings Bryan, against a man who was known as the great agnostic, Clarence Darrow, who had a reputation for defending the seemingly indefensible. In fact, according to many lists, he participated in 2 of the trials of the 20th century, 2 of the top trials of that century. On the 7th day, the trial, which was an open and shut case due to Scopes' unquestioned violation of the law, became an attack by the defense upon William Jennings Bryan's knowledge of science and understanding of Scripture. We'll return to that thought in just a minute, but let's think about what this trial was on the surface and what it was intended to be. On the surface, the trial should simply have been, did Scopes teach evolution in the classroom? On the surface, that would be an easy enough subject to debate and an easy enough a ground upon which to give a verdict. Perhaps have a few of the students who had heard him teach evolution take the stand. Did your teacher teach evolution in the classroom? He did. Did your teacher teach evolution in the classroom? He did. Case closed. Fine is $100. Don't do it again. We're dismissed. But remember that this was a circus. Remember that this was a show. This was something which was set up in order to bring to light the progressive theory of evolution, in order to attack the idea of the Butler Act that evolution should not be taught in the classroom, and ultimately to attack Scripture itself. Unwittingly, William Jennings Bryan had stepped into an arena that he wasn't prepared for, though he thought he was. We mentioned he was a skilled orator. In fact, he had run for president a number of times. I want to say 4 times, had not been successful, but had made a good run at it. One of the most important speeches during his day was one that he had made on the cross of gold with regard to the United States monetary system, the United States economy being based on the gold standard, arguing against that. This was a very brilliant man, but he was neither a scientist nor a theologian. He read his Bible, he studied his Bible, but he wasn't prepared for the questions that were going to be asked on this seventh day. Going back to the seventh day of this trial, he was questioned on Bible miracles. He was questioned on things like Jonah being swallowed by the whale, although we'll see that Clarence Darrow sort of turned the phrase a bit when he began that line of questioning. Question regarding things like the sun's standing still in Joshua's day and the date of the flood. Chronology in general, including the ignorance that Brian had of the population of Egypt in the 1500s BC and China in the 3000s BC. He was questioned concerning where Cain got his wife and so forth. Sadly, not understanding the error's implication, we're going to see in a few moments that Brian even conceded that he thought the days of Genesis could have been long periods of time. They're those days of creation in Genesis 1. But nonetheless, Brian, who otherwise argued for a literal reading of Genesis, made it known that he felt that the only purpose Mr. Darrow had was to slur at the Bible. I want us to go to the transcript of the trial itself and read a few things which we find from day 7 to get an idea of what William Jennings Bryan was up against. We're going to see that when we move further in our study, that William Jennings Bryan is physiologically very weak. Between his age, the heat, and now the pressure which was being placed upon him by Clarence Darrow, William Jennings Bryan certainly was not able to give the defense that he would like to have given. But let's consider some of the things which took place on that seventh day. I'm reading a transcript which is in Grebstein's book, Monkey Trial. On day 7, a little while into the day, Darrow asked Bryan concerning his study of the Bible, "Then you've made a general study of it?" To which Bryan answered, "Yes, I have. I've studied the Bible for about 50 years or sometime more than that, but of course I've studied it more as I've become older than when I was but a boy." Now we could pause there for just a moment and we could think about the type of instruction that one who has studied the Bible for 50 years may have received. Certainly this one would know much about the life of Christ, would be able to recount the events of the missionary journeys of Paul, the main events especially, would be able to look back to the Old Testament and give a history of God's people from the time of Abraham through his sons as they ultimately went down into Egypt, as they came back out of Egypt, as they wandered in the wilderness, moved into the land of Canaan and so forth, and then could probably recount the period of the Judges and could talk about the days when God's people said, "We want a king like the nations around us." But I don't know that many would have really focused in great detail upon some of the miracles and thinking, how am I going to deal with this when this miracle is attacked? You see, there's a difference between studying the Bible, knowing what it says, and studying it to defend it against the agnostic, studying to defend it against the Bible critic. That takes extra study. It certainly could be accomplished during that 50 years, but it's not something one's going to get merely in a daily Bible reading or in a typical Bible class situation. Darrow pressed, "Do you claim that everything in the Bible should be literally interpreted?" To which Brian said, "I believe everything in the Bible should be accepted as it is given there. Some of the Bible is given illustratively. For instance, you're the salt of the earth. I would not insist that man was actually salt or that he had flesh of salt, but it's used in the sense of salt as saving God's people." What he's saying there is figurative language in the Bible. And that's when Darrow asked this, "But when you read that Jonah swallowed the whale, or that the whale swallowed Jonah, excuse me please, how do you literally interpret that?" Well, the next little while was a back and forth upon whether the whale that swallowed Jonah was a whale or just a great fish. Those who appreciate Scripture, appreciate the power of God, understand that God specifically prepared this fish, whatever it was, for this occasion, and He could have prepared any fish for this occasion. It's a miracle. It's that which is above nature. It does not have to be argued from a literal/figurative standpoint. It can be argued from the power of God standpoint. Similarly, he was asked, "Mr. Bryan, have you ever pondered what would happen to the earth if it had stood still during Joshua's day?" "No, you have not. No, the God I believe in could have taken care of that, Mr. Darrow." "I see. Have you ever pondered what would actually happen to the earth if it stood still?" "No." "Don't you know it would have been converted into a molten mass of matter?" Again, the God that could make the earth stand still could also make the side effects not take place. The idea regarding the dating of the flood came not from the Bible, but from a chart which was in the Bible, which had been turned in as evidence. And that Bible, which was evidence, was quoted as being authoritative on the date of the creation using Archbishop Ussher's dating system. You and I understand that Archbishop Ussher wasn't inspired. And Brian says that is Bishop Utter's calculation, but Darrow says that's printed in the Bible you introduced. Yes, sir. Moving on, we mentioned that Brian agreed that it's possible that the days of creation could have been longer than 24-hour days. It's a very sad chapter because this chapter in the history of the battle between evolution and truth is one which has been wildly blown out of proportion and pictured as a victory for evolution. Truth be told, it was one man, neither scientist nor theologian, put on a stand, trying to defend as best he could that in which he had placed great faith. But he did so without having prepared to go to that stand. We mentioned his weakness. Brian actually ended up dying within 5 days of the trial. We mentioned the ease of the case. Brian won. Scopes was found guilty, charged $100. Brian paid that fine for the one that he was prosecuting. What a great man Brian was, though sadly unprepared for that day. What can we learn? We can learn that we need to be willing to take the stand, 1 Peter 3:15, but we need to know our limitations. We need to know that the enemy won't play fair. We need to be willing to say, I don't know, but I'll study this further. But definitely, we never need to misrepresent God or His Word.
This has been a presentation of GBN, the Gospel Broadcasting Network.